Good evening, everyone. My name is Malcolm Hackett. As well as being a Director of Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, I chair the board of the community company, which owns and operates the 5 local Bendigo Bank community bank branches, which have sponsored this webinar series. Welcome to the second Bushfire Resilience webinar of 2022, Your Vegetation, What You Need to Know. This topic was the most popular nomination by viewers of the 2021 webinar series. This series of presentations has been organised by Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, which is an independent, community-led, not-for-profit association focused on improving community awareness and preparedness for the threat of bushfire. These webinars have been organised on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. BRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of the many lands through our site and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connection to the land and waters across Australia. Please note that the webinars and the presenters are providing information, not advice. Our intention is to provide general information about risks to property and people. It's your responsibility to seek advice particular to your situation. Now, this may be a sensitive topic for some people, and the suggested services are shown on the screen. Thank you to our sponsors, our local Bendigo Bank community bank branches, CFA, the FRRR, Warrandyte Riverside Market, Nillumbik Shire Council, Safer Together, Rotary Diamond Creek, and Davey Pumps. Now a plug for our main sponsor. The Bendigo Bank community bank model is a franchise model, and it's unique in the world. It's allowed over 300 communities throughout Australia to establish a social enterprise based on banking, returning the vast majority of their profits back to the communities which established them. That's amounted to almost $300 million since the year 2000. Our 5 branches have returned over $7 million to our communities, and each year we also spend $4 million locally through employment, purchasing, rent and contracting. We champion the circular economy, where our expenditure locally multiplies the benefits through the community. We applaud buy local campaigns because strong shopping strips help to sustain strong communities. Of course, I want you all to bank local, because our bank branches make significant contributions to the economic life of Kinglake, Doreen Lorimer, Hurstbridge, Diamond Creek and Eltham. Last week, another bank announced it was pulling out of Eltham, reducing further the opportunity for face-to-face banking. In a digital age, it's true that financial enterprises can be run profitably on the internet from anywhere in the world, with fewer staff and no expensive bricks and mortar. However, we value the quality of service which can be provided when you know our staff personally, when the same person can follow a query or help with a sensitive inquiry. So do yourself a favour and your community a good turn. Go into a Bendigo Bank community bank branch and see what they have to offer. It might be the beginning of a worthwhile relationship. Thank you for registering your interest and for submitting your questions in advance. Please complete the feedback survey that we will send you, because it enables us to keep improving, and the collected results help other households living with bushfire risk. You'll be able to ask questions as we proceed using the Q&A function, but please keep your questions short and to the point. If we run out of time, we may be able to provide answers on our website. These webinars are being recorded and everyone who has registered will be sent the link. Now, our audience polls have been quite popular, and I invite you to participate in the first one tonight. I want you to think about your home. What building element would be most affected if vegetation, including the mulch, was ignited within 2 meters of your house? Now you've got a single choice. So you're thinking about your home and you're trying to work out which building element would be the most affected if it was ignited within 2 meters of your house. Okay, that's humming along. I think we might move on. Tonight's program will begin with a presentation from Dr. Kevin Tolhurst. Kevin's presented for us before, and we've had fantastic responses to his work. And then Dr. Justin Leonard will make a presentation after that. And then Kevin and Justin will be joined on the panel session by Dr. Peter Ashton from DELWP, that's the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Nick Guyett from the Surf Coast Shire. I think we've done pretty well on our poll, so I'll hand over to Kevin. Thanks, Kevin, for your participation.
Thanks, Malcolm. And thanks everyone for joining again for these webinars, because they're really quite important in terms of improving our understanding of what the environment that we're living in, and that understanding leads to much better outcomes and reduction in risk. So I've subtitled this Vegetation, Bushfire, Friend or Foe. Typically, vegetation is seen as something to be got rid of and reduced to a maximum extent. Hopefully after tonight, you will see that vegetation actually plays a positive as well as a potentially negative role, and it's a matter of getting the balance right. We see vegetation as being fuel, but not all fuel is vegetation. And even though all fuel comes from vegetation, but not all vegetation is fuel. So here's a couple of pictures from the 2009 fires, the Black Saturday fires, where we had pretty intense fires, but we can see there's still vegetation left. So the question is then, what part of the vegetation is the flammable part that we need to be dealing with, and how can we better deal with that to reduce the exposure to bushfire hazards? So some definitions to start with. Fuel, in the first instance, is organic material that releases energy through combustion. So it's stored chemical energy. And the process of combustion basically breaks down that complex organic material into simple inorganic products, including heat and water. So it's really just a reverse process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the gradual accumulation of energy in a chemical form through sunlight energy, nutrients and moisture from the soil into complex carbohydrates. And combustion just reverses that process, but it reverses what may have taken decades or even centuries to build up. It releases in minutes. So we can talk about the total fuel that might be available under the worst conditions. And that part of the fuel can be live or dead vegetative material. But we need to assess what the total fuel is and then see what part of that may be actually burnt under particular circumstances. So in prolonged drought, very severe fires, basically all the total fuel will be burnt, but not all vegetation. But the available fuel may in fact be a smaller component of that under milder conditions. So we need to be thinking about fires not just under those really extreme conditions, but also under milder conditions as well, because they can be just as lethal and destructive at a local level. So over the years, we've developed a better way of looking at fuels, particularly fine fuels in this case. And what we start off with is the leaf, bark and twig material on the ground, which we call the surface fuels. And they're important because they're largely dead material, so that they're basically just exchanging moisture between the atmosphere and soil and the fuel themselves. And they're fairly continuous across the ground. So they're really important in terms of carrying the fire. But we've also got what we also would call near surface fuel. So a more vertical component to it. So grasses, sedges, held up leaves and bark that might be held up in bushes and so on, which is even drier and it burns more readily again. So the surface and near surface fuels are really important in terms of carrying a fire. And the continuity of those two layers is the thing that's really important in terms of carrying a fire. Then above that, we've got elevated fuel. So the elevated fuel has some gap between the surface and the main area of fuel itself. And so it's possible to have a low intensity fire burn underneath here without incorporating the elevated fuel. But under more severe conditions, the fire that's supported by the surface and near surface fuels will get the flames into that elevated layer. And so the elevated layer becomes incorporated into the flaming zone of the fire. And then we've got the trees, and the parts of the trees that we're most interested, because we saw in that earlier photograph that a lot of the trees left behind after the fire, but the bark, particularly the dead bark on the outside of trees, is important in burning, but also producing embers to create spot fires. And potentially, if the flames connect between the surface, the elevated, and the canopy, we can have a canopy fire, and so there's more energy released from that fuel in the canopy as well. So this is a vertical stratification of fuels that's really important to appreciate, that we're looking at that vertical connectivity between the surface and the canopy of the fuels here. And there are things we can do to increase that separation. Likewise, there's things we can do at the surface layer to increase that separation. How we assess that, the overall fuel hazard assessment guide is a useful way of looking at that, and you can actually get a copy of that downloaded as a PDF file. All right, so fire spreads through connections. So fire is basically a chain reaction where a burning part of the fuel basically creates heat through radiation convection and preheats the neighbouring fuel around it. And through that process is a propagation from one area to another, and we call that the rate of spread of the fire. The fire will spread. And so where we've got continuous fuels, that spread is quite easy. But where we start to break that up into patches or fuels, create gaps between the fuels, then the flames generated by the initial fuel needs to be able to breach or reach over those gaps to the next lot of fuel if this chain reaction is to continue. So in a lot of forest situations, that's easily achieved. But embers are also important where we have these islands of fuels, because they can jump over, blow over the burning areas into fresh fuel areas and basically extend the fire and keep the chain reaction going that way. So horizontal connectivity is really important, but it can be broken as well by reducing the embers or reducing the continuity of surface fuel. Vertical continuity is something which is perhaps easier to see, where we basically are relying on flames from the surface and near surface fuels reaching into the elevated and bark fuels, and then the flames from the elevated and bark fuels may reach into the canopy fuels. So by creating a separation between those surface and near surface fuels and the canopy fuels, we can reduce the amount of available fuel to a fire, even under relatively severe conditions. So in addition to that, large fires are even better at connecting fuels both horizontally and vertically. Within the smoke plume, within the convection column of a fire, the heat transfer is averaged out much better. So preventing a fire from getting large in the first place reduces the amount of fuel that will be available. So it's not just a local effect that we might see, but also occurs over, what I'm talking about, a large fire here, that might be 2,000 to 4,000 hectares in size. So the game changes, and we've seen a lot of fires of this nature. The 2009 fires that we saw were certainly in this large fire category. And when we get those large fires, the heat from the burning wood material also contributes to the amount of convection, how big that convection column becomes, and the connection then with the fuels is increased. So it's not just about the fine fuels, but it's also about the woody fuel as well. So there's some guides here in terms of how we perhaps can differentiate fuels based on their characteristics. So here's an example of a house that was exposed to fire in 2005. You can see there's a reasonable, what looks to be a reasonable defendable space around it. We can see some green area there, which was a heavily mown area, but then we've got some vegetation close to the building itself. And here we can see some of that vegetation that was close to the veranda and to the windows here was sufficient to set fire to the veranda and break the glass on the windows. So here the occupants of this property had thought they'd done quite a good job at creating a defendable space around the house, but they wanted garden up close against the house. And that really became a major problem in the passage of the fire. And it took a lot of effort to defend this house. Obviously, it was defended successfully in that the house is still there, the garage was lost, but it did take probably 10 years off the life of the owners in this case. So we need to understand the flammability of fuels, and there are three aspects to flammability. There's the ease of ignition, the ability to sustain burning, and the amount of heat that's released in that combustion process. And how we can work out the flammability of fuel in terms of those three attributes, it's related to the fineness of the material, so the thickness of the leaf, the twig, the bark material, and what we consider to be fine fuel is dead material less than 6 millimeters in thickness, and live material less than 2 millimeters in thickness. The reason for the difference there is that the live fuel has a lot more moisture, so it doesn't burn as readily. 6 millimeter live fuel is more difficult to burn than the equivalent in dead fuel. So that's the 6 and the 2 comparison is an indication of how much more difficult it is to burn live vegetation compared with dead vegetation. Then there's the degree of connectedness, so percentage ground cover, canopy density, the vertical gaps that we see. So the degree of connectedness is important, and that's something we can manipulate. The chemical composition of the fuels themselves, so whether or not there's extractives, so oils, waxes, and resins inherently as part of the chemical composition of the plant material, which actually makes them a lot more flammable compared with plants that have a high salt or nutrient content, which actually reduces their flammability. So where you have oils, waxes, or resins present, a plant that might be 1 metre high might produce flames 4 to 6 metres in height, whereas without those oils and waxes, the flame heights would perhaps only be twice the height of the vegetation. So those oils, waxes, resins have a huge impact on the ability to jump across gaps in fuel, and therefore the flammability of the vegetation. The dryness, the natural dryness of the vegetation, and we need to take into account what happens under drought as well, but the degree of succulence. So in a sense, if you squeeze or squash the leaf material, plant material, do you get moisture out of it or not? So if you're not getting moisture out of it, then it's going to be relatively dry and burn more readily. Whereas if moisture squeezes out, then it's going to be, the fire is going to have to dry that moisture out, and it's going to be a lot more resistant to burning. And finally, the fifth point here is the amount of fuel. So that determines the total heat output, And that's really important as the fire scales up. So both duration of heating, but also the amount of heat. So if we look at some examples here, here's a pencil cypress that's got a nice green exterior. We say, okay, well, maybe there's going to be a lot of moisture there, so it shouldn't burn very well. But if we actually look inside the that cypress, we see that there's a lot of retained dead leaf material inside. And given the vertical orientation of this particular tree and the density of it, how it's packed, this tree will burn very readily. So when you're assessing the flammability of some of the vegetation, it's not just about what you can see on the outside, you need to look on the inside too. So it would be nearly impossible to remove all that dead material from a plant such as this. So it's a really inappropriate plant to be planting close to your house, as we saw in the Canberra fires, because of this retained dead material. Here's a hedge out of another plant, happens to be New Zealand mirrorbush, but green exterior. But when we look inside, there's not that much dead material in there. So there's no suspended dead material. So this is going to be very hard to burn, and the leaves themselves are fairly fleshy. They're fairly low flammability. So here's a plant that actually would provide a reasonable shield to heat, whether it's radiation or convective heat, and not contribute much to the fire itself. So not all plants are equal in this sense. And gorse, which is notorious in terms of how well it burns, you see when you look inside the gorse plant, the dead leaves hang on for 2 to 3 years after they've died. And so there's a lot of dead material in the plant. And added to that, it has a resinous component. So it's a very rich fuel. And so notoriously good burner. And our New Zealand friends have actually had a look at some of this, and here's a great demonstration of comparing different plants in terms of the flammability.
We measure plant flammability on this device here at Lincoln University, which we call our plant barbecue. Now, different types of plants will burn to different degrees, and we're going to show you an example of a highly flammable plant and also a low flammability plant.
So as you can see, this is a great option to plant around your house because it eliminates a lot of the fire risk. These plants aren't fireproof, but it does reduce the risk and it slows down the spread of a wildfire.
So what's really important from that video is that all plants will burn, but some plants are much more difficult to get to burn than others because of their lower level of flammability. So we can use that. So if we have a look at some good veg, bad veg, what we're sort of looking at here is an area in Marysville after the 2009 fires. You can see a house that's been destroyed by fire, but there's a lot of vegetation around that house that has only been scorched, as it hasn't actively burnt. So we need to understand what perhaps has gone on here. So those plants will have reduced the winds, they will have reduced the number of embers impacting the building, the radiation exposure and the convective heat exposure, but that house has still been lost. And that's due to more the vegetation in the broader landscape that was producing massive number of embers, and also how the house was built, maintained, and how much fuel there was in close proximity to the house itself. So vegetation that's good from the point of view of protecting house are things that have high water content or salt content and minimal dead component. So some of these succulents or semi-succulents fit into the bill. Here we're in a wet forest where there's high moisture content and a high life to dead ratio, but under drought that may in fact dry out. And then there's exotic species like deciduous trees, which have high moisture content, high mineral content, and a high live to dead ratio. So not a lot of fuel to actually burn. So we need to analyze the plants and the environment they're in to see how flammable they might be. Here I've got what I've called the Jekyll and Hyde vegetation in a sense. It's quite a moist environment, dense understory, not that much suspended material in the elevated fuel, but there's a lot of fuel on the ground, including a lot of woody material. But there is a big separation between the surface fuels and the canopy fuels. So you would need fairly significant flames and conditions to burn this forest. And that does occur, but perhaps only once in 100 or 200 years. Over here, a Victorian example, the other one is Western Australia. We've basically got the same sort of thing. Big separation between the surface and the tops of these trees. And a lot of moisture retained in the understory, but in drought conditions, it can become flammable. So there's a trade-off here between retaining moisture and but reducing the amount of dead material that would be available during drought conditions. Here, something that I call perhaps good vegetation from a fire point of view, very little chance of the fire actually getting into the canopies. Very little surface fuel. This is on the left, box ironbark forest, on the right, it's red gum forest. The bark is tightly held or live. There's a poor connection vertically and relatively low level of fuels present. And if we look at the horizon to see where flames might need to reach to basically give us a canopy fuel, the distance to the flames would need to be might be 100, 150 metre long. Now, the surface fuel is not going to generate flames that long to get it into the canopy. In a different environment here, where we've got the odd scattered tree, but a shrubby, heathy shrub understory, very flammable vegetation, high level of connectivity, both vertically and horizontally, and exposure to wind is quite high. So very flammable vegetation, similar down on the coast, where we've got strong vertical and horizontal connectivity, a lot of dead materials in amongst it all. Going back to another box ironbark sort of situation, we've got where we've got a shrubby understory. The distance between the surface and the crown here is reduced, but it's probably not reduced to the extent that you would easily get a canopy fire. And the elevated fuel here is basically all live material. There's not much dead material on it, so the elevated fuel would not burn all that readily. And in this case, it looks very verdant. What would it look like under drought conditions? That's the question we've got to ask. In this case, it's largely exotic trees that would have high mineral content, so low flammability. So this would be a relatively safe site. This happens to be in Beechworth. You wouldn't need as tall flames to reach into the canopy here, but then there isn't the surface fuel to support it. So what we've got to look at when we're looking at fuels, we can divide fuels or vegetation into three types. Fuels that will burn only after prolonged exposure to heat and flames, such as succulent plants or plants with high mineral content. There are those plants that will retard fire, but under very dry conditions will still burn. So things like wattles and some deciduous trees and shrubs. And then there are other plants which will burn readily, like the gorse we just saw in that demonstration. So even under mild conditions, they will burn quite readily. So many grasses, heaths, eucalypts, conifers fit into that category. So the 1 and 2 type vegetation are the ones that we want to promote, and one are the ones that are going to give us the first category are the ones that are going to give us the greatest protection close to the house. So there are a number of guides you can get that help determine what these species look like. Hopefully you've got a better understanding of being able to make that assessment yourself, but these guides exist, and I'll give you a list of where you can get these from at the very end. There's useful websites, CSIRO, that's set up. Justin Len, you'll see there about myths, the overall fuel hazard guide. And what we need to appreciate is that not all vegetation is adding to the fuel. This is Marysville. Look at all the trees with all the canopies still on it, green canopies. The fuel here was predominantly coming from the surrounding forest and the houses and the fuels immediately around the houses themselves. In fact, the 5% or so of houses that actually survived, a lot of them were actually closer to the native bush than they were to the centre of the town. So in summary, all fuel is vegetation, comes from vegetation, but not all vegetation is fuel. Fuel levels can be significantly reduced without removing all the vegetation. It's just a matter of trying to break up the connections, vertical and horizontal. And low flammability fuels reduce the severity of the fire impact by reducing the winds, embers, and radiation. So maintaining the fuel of the vegetation is important, but we've got to make sure that the flames don't connect. And good garden design combined with good maintenance can significantly reduce your bushfire risk. So there's a list. I don't expect you to write those down, but you'll be able to get a copy of that at the end of the talk. So I'll stop there. So thanks very much for your attention for now.
Thanks, Kevin. I found that most helpful and really clear. Now I'd like to welcome Justin Leonard. Justin has had some fantastic feedback for his presentations, and I'm sure this will be equally as good. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'll just bring up my presentation. So yeah, I've got the job of following the very articulate Kevin Tolhurst and to, I guess, reinforce some of those ideas and learnings through an approach of exploring some of those myths and misconceptions around bushfire vegetation. So let's run through those, a small set of those myths and misconceptions so we can sort of re-explore and reinforce those ideas about the role of vegetation in the bushfire events that really threaten us. So the first myth I want to present to you is a myth around the fact that the speed of a fire is best slowed by reducing tall vegetation like trees. That's certainly the reverse is actually true in this case. The trees offer quite a lot of wind attenuation, and reducing the wind attenuation on those surface and near surface fuels that Kevin was describing in detail actually slow the fire through those surface and near surface fuels. So fires will actually travel slower through a heavily wooded forest, so through the surface fields of a heavy wooded forest, than they would through an open grassland. So we actually see higher speed fires through open areas, open grassland areas, than we would in forests. And I guess woodlands are in the middle. So yeah, trees certainly help to actually slow the fire rather than slower than it could otherwise go in the same weather conditions. And I guess slowing and abating or blocking those fire actions as they emerge from large areas of fuel is certainly highly beneficial. It's great to use the idea of strategic trees and planting around houses. Those winds that drive the fires are also winds that can act on your house and weaken the house or increase its likelihood of being ignited or lost. Let's move on to the next myth. Myth number 2 is buildings not directly near bushfires are relatively safe. This certainly isn't the case, and what we find is houses are readily lost many hundreds of metres from where you would call the perimeter of a formal bushfire, and that's because of those actions that Kevin described, like embers reaching into those urban areas, and they can reach in hundreds of metres. But it's also surface fires or those surface fuels where fires track through the urban environments, finding those surface fuels, and those surface fuels then interacting with the structures themselves. Now, we don't call that a bushfire front. The bushfire front kind of finishes in the continuous vegetation, but its actions play out in urban environments in really interesting ways. So houses many hundreds of metres from where you would say is a defined bushfire prone area are certainly at risk because of that ember and surface fire actions. And of course, the drier and drier the landscape becomes, the more potentially active those surface fuels and the continuity of those surface fuels in those urban environments become. So as we prime the environment to be really suitable for carrying significant fires through it, that those same actions prime the urban interface to be able to carry those low-level fires, surface fires through and around them, which means it's down to the detailing of immediately around the house. They're only small fires, but when those small fires can get close to and contact those combustible elements around your house, you've got problems. And then, of course, houses burn other houses down. And I guess typically the statistics are showing that sort of loss up around the 500, 700 metres, sort of in the upper limits, is sort of the distances we find loss sort of tapering off as a function of distance from bushfires. Let's move on to the next myth. Myth number 3 is leaves are the main source of embers. So I guess Kevin pretty much articulated the answer, the right answer to this myth. It's not actually, leaves can play a small role in being an ember or an ember source. But in fact, the vast majority of embers are generated by bark, and that bark could be either still attached to the trees themselves, that might be bark that's also fallen on the ground and been reactivated, and it could be even bark that's been deliberately brought in and used as ground mulch. They're great ways of sourcing embers. But I guess the bark on the trees is particularly problematic because it's up in the wind field where they're relatively easy to pick up and carry. And of course, those embers can reach other trees at the bark, bait the bark in those trees, and embers play obviously a key role in both direct ignition of elements in an urban environment and in helping propagate the fire over those gaps that that Kevin described. It is worth pointing out that as this bark burns, you might notice that after a fire, a lot of this bark is burnt off many of the trees. And Kevin, particularly that picture on the front of the fire hazard guide, it really shows a whole lot of trees where all the bark is burning on those trees. Now, the intensity of flame from just that bark continuity isn't enough to activate the crowns in the trees. You need much more continuity, shrubs and elevated fuels to do that. So the bark in itself doesn't carry flames into the canopy and activate the canopy, but as I said, it's a fantastic source of bark and quite a persistent one, both during the fire front event and for many minutes and possibly hours after the fire's passed. The winds continue to carry and activate those bark, and the ember storms can be very persistent long after the fire front's passed. Myth number 4, embers only arrive from the direction of the prevailing winds. If anyone's had to endure a real ember storm in one of these worst scenario days, they would describe many wind directions and even multiple fire fronts events arriving. And that's because the winds are, both the prevailing winds can involve wind changes and wind shifts, but the fire front itself also is a strong interactor with those winds. And the complex sort of vegetation and building terrain that the wind's flowing over and swirling around really trains the wind into really complex directions. And I guess the embers track through all those swirls and blow in so many different and complex ways and find really interesting places to land and find lots of nooks and crannies to sort of activate into small flames and react to your house. So it's and in fact, in a lot of our studies, we've actually found that ember attack on structures is often more prevalent on the leeward side, the downwind side of houses, than it is on the windward side. So the winds are blowing the embers over, and they're sort of tracking and being drawn into like a vortex on the other side of the house. And it's in that area where they can settle and be quite effective at igniting the house. And the house actually burns from the non-fire side back through towards the side that the fire approached, which is also the side of the prevailing wind. So please think of embers and the way they might approach or impact your house as you know, multi-directional. Myth number 5, mulch spread under shrubs helps reduce weeds and bushfire risk. So I guess that's a real primer. It obviously isn't. The mulch itself represents a very high fuel load in itself and is particularly problematic to houses because it can burn quite aggressively, but it also can burn for quite a long time. So the total heat load over a time frame from just a mulch bed on its own is a high risk to even well-designed and built compliant houses. And I guess this picture is a really pertinent example where it was a relatively newly built house up in the Sydney region. It was built to Bell 29, non-combustible wall fascias. It's such a new build that they hadn't even started to plant out the gardens, but they had put down a mulch bark layer to obviously, you know, stabilize the soil. That burnt in this fire event without any other heat sources on this face of the house. And while it wasn't quite enough to break the toughened glass windows, if these were plain glass windows, they would have broken for sure. But they were enough to melt the plastic blinds behind the windows. So it was one of those preserved examples of where the radiant heat on these windows would have been upwards of 15 kilowatts, but somewhere less than 40 kilowatts, which is sort of the relative threshold that you would easily break plain glass, but you wouldn't quite break the toughened glass windows. So yeah, just mulch on its own, let alone mulch working with problematic plants, is really worth understanding and addressing, and certainly something that you shouldn't put up against a building. Myth number 6, Australia's bushfires are so severe that there's nothing, there's not a lot we can do to prepare for or respond to. So I guess time and time again, I go out and study the context of how things are lost in bushfire events. And probably one of the most profound statistics we keep coming back to is that well over 90% of the houses that we find are lost in bushfires didn't really experience a fire front at all. Like a fire front didn't turn up, provide direct flame contact, or provide sufficient radiation to have been a direct threat to the house, which really leaves all these other processes like surface fire attack, ember storms, neighbours' houses burning other houses down, fences burning. It's all these other interactions that are actually the predominant reason why houses burn down. So it's really a myth to make a presumption that these fires are in themselves so severe that it's difficult to respond, because the severity of the fires aren't really the driver of why so many houses are lost in these events. And I guess this this map of Duffy, which is a an outer suburb of Canberra that was impacted in those iconic fires in 2004 really highlights how a fire didn't, it certainly turned up and a surface fire burnt up to, but it benefited from this large road barrier, which was sufficient to prevent any real direct interaction from a fire front from the other side of the road. And in fact, many of the streetscape pictures really showed relatively unaffected plants in the front yards of these houses on the fire side. So they were like an indicator that the radiation and flames weren't really an action that came across these roads. But what did come across was an aggressive ember storm, and that created lots of surface fires, and these suburbs were in an extreme state of drought when that fire turned up. So the gardens were desiccated, and there was so much available fine surface fuels and some elevated fuels represented by the managed gardens in around these houses, and lots of combustible elements on the houses and fences, etc., that really caused the urban fire processes that led to these losses. And I guess the clumping of these losses too do highlight how structure and structures do burn each other down as well. And my final myth for the evening, myth number 7, is, I guess, if you leave early and you're fully insured, then there's really no need to really tackle this challenge around reducing fuels. And I guess the real take home for this myth is there's so many people with well-intentioned plans to leave early under all circumstances that a fire might turn up and threaten them or their house that are at their house when the fire turns up. And the people that leave at that time or try to leave in the last moment are a mix of people that had every intention to leave early, and also a mix of people that didn't have fire plans and didn't really have an intention. But the intention doesn't mean that's how it's definitely going to play out. And I guess this graph, which you may have seen in some of my previous presentations, which is really representative of, I guess, all the fatalities over most of our iconic fires in the past, from 0 to 100% of fatalities that have occurred outside. Over 60% of those fatalities that occur outside were less than 100 meters from their own house. So it really focuses the context on people that are either fleeing their house, trying to get back to their house, defending their house. The actual amount of fuel and fuel continuity and fuel management on their property and in their immediate streetscape is a very real and imminent threat that they may need to face. And I'd strongly encourage people to really think about many layers of risk management and risk treatment, and to put, I guess, the priority of considering fuels on your land, along your driveway, around your house as a really key contingency for not only improving your house's survival, whether you're there or not, but in the event that your plan A, B, and C doesn't play out the way you hoped or aspire to, because every fire and every fire circumstance throws its own curveballs, and we need these contingencies to ensure we're all safe in future fires. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Justin. Some brilliant work again, and really clearly presented to us. Now, can I get Rowan to show us the results of poll number 1? Kevin, have you got any comments you'd like to make about what you see there?
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised that the windows and decking come up as highest in terms of building elements that would be most affected. But really, the subfloor and electrical and gas connections too, they're all sort of important. The point is really that any fuel within a couple of meters of your house is problematic. So it doesn't really matter in a way whether your windows break or your decking catches a light. It's going to make it really hard to defend your house. So it's good that people are recognising the windows and deckings are key elements. Justin would be in a much better place, I suppose, to give you the statistics or the relativity of those. But I think it's really important to appreciate that fuel close to your house is such a critical component to threatening the integrity of your property.
Justin, any additional comments?
Yeah, well, I guess the poll really has, all those elements are potentially at risk, and I guess every house isn't created equal. So I expect to see a really good spread about where the relative weaknesses are for a diverse range of houses. I'd say windows and decking do come up all the time, but if you do have a raised subfloor house that isn't fully enclosed, that's easily as susceptible as a deck to that vegetation and vegetation attack. So it's really about casting a really keen eye onto any of those elements that are proximal, because the fire will exploit and find those weakest elements, and there's a good sort of starting checklist of things to work through.
Thank you both. Now, I'd like to welcome Peter and Nick to our panel. You guys have been watching that. Have you got any additional comments you'd want to make just on that poll while we're there?
Oh, look, yeah, I mean, those things are kind of pretty clear to most of us. And I guess, going back to what Kevin said, it's like the whole package needs to be thought about, and the weakest link kind of needs to be thought about as well.
And I'll get Rowan. We've got a second poll. I'll get him to launch that for us, and people can have a think about this. Now, I want you to think about vegetation that's within 30 metres of your house. So it's your house. You're thinking out 30 metres. What would be your pre-summer priority action that you'll take? And you can only have one choice there. It's your prime action that you're going to take before summer arrives about the vegetation that's 30 metres from your house. All right, while people are filling that in, have we got some Q&A questions coming up for us now? Peter and Nick have got extensive experience in an area of the world that I'm sure we can all learn a lot from. So their comments about preparing the landscape and in your own landscape will be really useful here. How do you actually remove the fibrous bark from a tree trunk? How should you go about doing that? Kevin, perhaps you're the starting point.
There's a couple of ways of doing it. The worst trees in terms of their ember production are the stringy bark trees. So they're sort of the rough fibrousy bark trees. And you can remove that perhaps physically with something like a rake and get it back, get rid of the furrowed part of the bark and get it back to a fairly tightly held bark. And that would significantly improve reduce the fuel and reduce the number of embers. Another way is that when the ground's wet and everything is wet, after a sunny day or whatever, you can actually light up individual trees. It's called candling sometimes, and basically let the fire remove the bark off the trees. And that may actually reach further up the trees, and it removes the loosest part of the bark, the most flammable part of the bark. But you'd want to be a little careful about doing that, of course, to make sure that nothing else is going to catch a light around you. So it's a bit technical. But using a rake or physically stripping the rough bark off doesn't leave you with a black stem. It is certainly worthwhile doing that. But you've got to also consider what's happening in the broader landscape several hundred metres away from you in terms of the amount of bark that you would get from there. But the embers you might get from there, but certainly it's worthwhile removing it in the vicinity of your house anyway. Justin might provide some detail on that as well in terms of house ignition from bark close to the trees, close to the buildings.
Justin, any comments?
Yeah, certainly. I guess ember risk and ember loads that our house experience, I guess, decays rapidly with distance from the soil. So, you know, the wrong type of barky trees, like that Kevin described close to houses, is going to be a direct problem. So, I guess the long-term solution is ideally, as those plants mature and may need to be replaced, think about getting them or replace them with low flammability bark, eucalypts and native or non-native. But yeah, certainly those Kevin described are sort of key. I think the other silver bullet to solving the ember problem is not a house that can burn from embers and not have elements around the house that's ember susceptible. I think it's a bit of a folly to think completely remove embers as a source from the landscape, but we can approach the ideal situation, which is having a house that just can withstand a barrage of embers.
Peter and Nick, you've been involved with some of these issues in across the landscape in your area of the world. Have you got any things you want to add to that? Jump in, either one.
Yeah, I guess Nick and I worked together for many years at Surf Coast, and I've just recently come over to DELWP. So yeah, we've sort of been involved at that kind of household level and trying to take some of the science that you've heard tonight from Kevin and Justin and try to work with community in a sort of practical way. And I guess a lot of the programs, and Nick might touch on this a bit later, the Surf Coast, excuse me, was to try and find these practical ways and bring the community on that sort of journey. And when you think about it, it's not that complicated. We just have to think about it how a fire would think about it when it gets to your place. And that's how I often sort of, you know, think about it in those terms. If you're a fire, where can you get to? What can you light up? And if you think about it that way, often the answers are quite simple, and there's some things you can do that make really big differences to your sort of risk.
Nick?
Yeah, thanks. A lot of the work we do is trying to work directly with community. So we have a number of fuel reduction programs and have held them up and down the coast, where council will remove the fuel out of parts of our land that are close to houses and that are going to make houses susceptible. But we also ask householders to remove fuel from their land as well. Then we all pile it up at the front, and we get our truck and chipper to go through and pick it up. In the past we've called it weeds to mulch because we targeted the weeds first. They're a really easy one to take out, and often a significant source of fuel. We've now got a couple of these that are actually community driven. So for instance, Moggs Creek, and then there's another community nearby in Forest. And it's really the community that drives this. They decide when and where and that sort of thing. They organise themselves, and then we contribute by coming in the week after that they organise their action week. We'll remove that fuel for them. We also offer like individual property advice. We'll go for a walk and a talk on a property, and CFA offers this as well through their PABS program, Property Advice Service. I guess availability is always an issue, so you'd have to talk to your own local CFA and your own local council, but it's really helpful. I think anyway, we've got some really experts in this space that can point out those things that you may not recognise. As well, if your house has been built since 2009 and you're in a bushfire risk area, check your planning permit. There's a really good chance there might be some provisions in there around what the vegetation on your property is meant to look like, your landscaping. And the CFA and local council will have endorsed this as best practice at the time. So if you're unsure where to start, check your planning permit. A lot of people don't realise they've got this ongoing obligation there. And then I guess another thing, as we go around and we inspect pre-summer, we sometimes issue fire prevention notices as part of an enforcement program. Now, if you're getting a fire prevention notice from your local council, and if you're getting them repeatedly, you need to have a look at what you're doing. Even if you're not getting them, every council in Victoria, anyway, has a municipal fire prevention officer. Great source of info, generally, and I'm not sure if all the local government colleagues will thank me for this, but generally we're happy to have a chat. Give us a call, ask us some advice.
We've got some more questions here on specific questions on trees, vegetation. Do deciduous English or European trees provide ember risk reduction? This person's noted that in investigations in Kinglake suggest that English oaks actually protected houses. And I think you touched on that, Kevin. But is there anything additional you'd want to say?
Yeah, so I guess the thing, when you look at a lot of European type trees, they've got hard bark, so they're not fibrousy bark. So something like an oak, the bark doesn't burn that readily, and it's not producing embers. So it's quite different to a stringy bark eucalypt, for example. So elm trees, fruit trees, there are lots of different sorts of trees, and even a lot of conifers. But then the conifer has the disadvantage of the flammable leaves. So the deciduous trees have both low flammability leaves as well as really low flammability bark. So you're getting rid of the ember problem as well as reducing the chance of having canopy fires and the like. So you may not necessarily want exotics, and that's where I think a lot of the work that's been done around the place, including down the Surf Coast, looking at trees that are, plants which are endemic but are of the lower flammability type. You're better off in a neighbourhood to be able to increase those lower flammability plants in a neighbourhood, or at least on your own property, but preferably in a neighbourhood, to reduce the overall risk. Exotics are one solution, but that's not necessarily going to suit everyone who's living in an environment that they want to have as an Australian native environment, if you like. But yeah, certainly the exotics are good.
Well, Nick's last discussion really led towards that idea of neighbours working together, fire guard groups or community groups working together. What other sorts of things have you done down in the Surf Coast to get people to think about the sorts of vegetation, Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. We've offered a plant replacement program in the past as well. So yeah, swapping out those, and as part of our fuel reduction programs, there might be plants that are just inappropriately sited, but there's still space for trees and plants on the property. There's a fantastic list in one of the CFA's publications. I think Kevin showed it during his presentation before, landscaping your garden for bushfire, and we pinched that and produced our own landscaping your surf coast garden for bushfire. And within that have species lists of plants that are better for fire. We also made a video on that as well, so check that out. The CFA has a really comprehensive, fantastic list of better species.
Peter, anything you want to add?
Just one thing there with the plants. So while some plants can be more flammable than others, some of them have a sort of weaker structure or more open structure, and that's less conducive to the whole thing flaming at once. So we've kind of used that to our advantage down the surf coast, where we've got some endemic plants there. I'll give an example. So there's a Banksia down there that it doesn't grow in a tight sort of bunch. It grows quite sparse. So even though the leaves are quite flammable, just the way the plant's structured means it's not going to produce a really big flame.
I've lost you there. Justin, I reckon I've got a question here for you. Hedges can act as an effective windbreak, but they can also act as fuel. How do you reconcile that to reduce the risk?
Yeah, so I guess the specific distance that the hedge is from the house is obviously a primary concern. So if it flared, do you have a direct radiant heat and flame contact risk? So you want it a fair way away. And yeah, and I guess there's also something to consider is there's sort of really problematic hedges, but then there's potentially hedges that use specific species and are maintained in a certain way that are going to not burn anywhere near it aggressively as other types of hedge. So go through the whole veg selection process and the sort of structural assessment things that Kevin articulated. And yeah, it is a pretty difficult trade-off because they and I guess timber fences are similar. They can attenuate some wind and block some radiant heat, but at the same time they can be activated and be fuel sources themselves. So it's definitely worth considering both the pros and cons when you're thinking about each of those elements.
Malcolm, I think one of the thing about a hedge, for example, is the problem that it's got good connectivity. So rather than having a perimeter hedge that's basically continuous around your property, for example, just having smaller sections of hedge, if you like, and then intersperse it with other plants within your property so that you don't have that continuity is one way of getting over it. So hedges per se, particularly if they're trimmed hedges, are a problem because it increases that density that Pete Ashton was talking about before. It increases the density of the plant, which makes it actually improves the connectivity within the plant, which makes them more flammable. So both dispersing the planting, but also dispersing the branch and leaf structure within the plant is something that you ought to aim for. So you still get the wind reduction and the ember production and the shading effects, but you're not increasing the flammability unnecessarily.
I guess when I'm thinking of hedges, I guess I'm imagining sort of cypressy type things, but then those other examples of the waxy leaved plants, I've seen hedges out of that sort of stuff, and I can imagine that might be more suitable as well.
Just to quickly finish that one off, a solution that we've found is to cut out, say, every second or third plant of the hedge and replace it with a panel, some sort of screening, non-combustible screening. So you still get that that shade, that wind barrier, but you break up that connectivity really effectively.
This is similar but different. Someone here wants to know about, can you talk about the risks of having grapevines on pergolas to keep the hot summer sun? I think it comes back to you, Justin. You would have seen some examples of this.
Yeah, so I guess a grapevine isn't what we call a highly problematic vegetation type, but it does have some degree of bark, and I guess year on year the leaves do fall and sort of lodge into little crevices and whatnot. So when the ember storms come, they could exploit and find aspects of that grapevine that could have small flame sources. So I think the takeaway there is that the grapevine isn't going to go off really aggressively, but it is adding a small degree of additional fuel to fuel load to your structure. So if you're going to take that type of approach, be very careful about what you choose as the support structure for that grapevine. So think, don't use treated pine, go for metal frameworks and processes, and be quite careful about the eave design and the walls and the elements of the house that are connected or intimate with the vine, because it's going to have to put up with some low intensity flame attack, which is often the way houses are initially ignited from a very small attack. So a house that's resistant to that's going to be okay. And of course, really practical way of shading and retaining moisture in the landscape and keeping some heat off your house. But yeah, think about it as a small flame source.
Kevin?
So Malcolm, I guess just to continue on from what Justin's sort of saying is, it's often the dead material in these plants that are a problem. So whether it's dead bark or whether it's dead leaves that are sort of held on the plant that provide fuel to sort of spread the fire. I tried to demonstrate that a little with the pencil cypress. That was an extreme case, or the gorse. But a lot of plants, if you actually trim the dead material out of them, it significantly reduces the flammability of those plants. So when they're young, there's not much dead material there, but as they get older, you need to be pruning out the dead material, and need to be very cautious about pruning them to shape, like topiary, if you like, because that actually helps contain the fuel inside it. So it's not necessarily visible, but it's there. The embers will find it if it's dead materials there. So pruning to remove dead material is really quite important in removing the flammability of that vegetation. And it's one of the things in that overall fuel hazard guide that is important. There is the percentage of dead material in the structure of the plant dramatically changes the flammability. We see it in grass when we're talking about grass curing. When it's 50% cured, so half dead, half live, it will burn reasonably well. And of course, when it gets to closer to 90 or 100% cured, where it's mostly dead and very little live, it'll burn very readily. But when it's closer to only 10 or 20% cured, basically it won't carry a fire. So same amount of plant material, but the proportion of dead to live dramatically changes the flammability of those. And it goes just as much for shrubs and trees as it does for, and grapevines for that matter, as it does for grass.
Here's a question that perhaps it's about whether you can mitigate some of these issues. Say you've got a shrub, it's close to the house and you really love it. Will sprinklers on vegetation stop them from catching fire?
Justin, that might be a good one for you, but the trouble is, have you got enough water, and can you keep it wet under those really windy extreme heat conditions? But Justin may have seen some examples of that.
Yeah, it's really a case of the bigger the plant or the more fine dead fuel on it, the more water and the more frequently you're going to have to wet and re-wet. The fine fuels under those really hot, dry days take a surprisingly short amount of time to dry back out and make themselves available. So we're talking about comprehensive water coverage and quite frequent re-wetting. So if you're not sort of, you know, really redousing the plant every 5 to 10 minutes, it's quite possible that the finest fuels in that structure could dry out. Those fine fuels could activate, and I guess the initial torching of those fine fuels can kind of drive off a bit more residual moisture of the rest of the fine fuels, and it can burn maybe not as severely as a completely dry starting point, but could burn to completion and provide some problems. So, you know, it's probably a little bit of a stretch to say we really want to hedge right up against our house and I'm going to use water as the solution. You'd really, you know, want to think about that reliability and redundancy of being able to really keep that thing dry, and of course have a watering system that's reliable enough to get you through the entire fire event as well.
Yeah. Now this is probably a question for all of you, and perhaps Peter can start, but why do fire departments use prescribed burning when after about 3 years the regrowth is much thicker than before the burn? In our forests, they only promote ladder plants. So I suppose that's someone trying to get all of that together. Peter?
Yeah, I'll start off. So yeah, that definitely does happen in some vegetation types, in some places in our forests, not the whole lot. So that might come back in 3 years, but what you have actually done in your prescribed burning is taken that bark off. As we heard earlier, that has a sort of impact downstream with embers, so that persists for quite a while. You've also taken a lot of that dead material that's been sort of building up over many years out of the system. That takes a long time to come back as well. So you do have benefits that persist much longer than 3 years. I would also say to that, if that's in an area that's really important to the town and that particular parcel will have impact, then as a community we need to look at potentially bringing that round more often. And what you'll find, if it gets more fired, generally the sort of woody, the hard-seeded shrubs, which generally make that thickening happen, start to sort of thin out over time. So that might be something that needs to be thought about for some areas. In other areas, you might not worry about it as much, but you'll take the benefits from the bark and the sort of dead fuel. Would be, yeah, that's probably how I'd answer that. Maybe Kevin's obviously had a long history in this as well. He might be able to weigh into that as well.
Yeah, look, I guess prescribed burning doesn't have to result in thicker vegetation. As Peter says, if you do a very frequent low intensity fire, it can basically do the reverse. It can actually thin that vegetation out. What you want to avoid is sort of, say, every 10 or 15 years having a fairly hot fire, because that will promote the shrubby understory. So that can be counterproductive to some extent. But it's not a problem with the prescribed burning per se, but how it's necessary, how it happens to be carried out. So prescribed burning, you think of it in the way that there's energy being released in that burning process. That's energy that's not there next time when a high intensity fire comes through. So you have removed some of that energy from the system, and the regrowth has very little dead material in it, so it won't burn as fiercely to start with. But the fires really perhaps need to be quite frequent, as Peter was saying, in some of these areas to change the structure in the first place, get it to a more manageable level.
Nick, did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I think highlighting example Peter said, if there's a place close to town that's seen as holds a lot of value there, that prevents a whole change of vegetation type. Cutting out some of those shrubs to start with can have that immediate impact. Cutting them out, removing them, like physical removal, and then that low intensity burn can certainly help even further.
Here's a question. I think lots of people would like to know the answer to this. Do all eucalypts have roughly equal high level of flammability and oils and resins and so on? Or are some eucalypts safer than others? Kevin, I reckon that's one for you to kick off.
Yeah, no, they're not all equal. So things like peppermints and blue gums, for example, have relatively high oil content. They don't have resins, but they have relatively high oil content. And then you've got some species like spotted gum, which is you find more up the east coast, has very low oil content. So you can choose eucalypt species with greater or lesser oil content. And the trick is to basically grab the leaves, crush them, and see how strong the smell is. So any leaf, whether it's a eucalypt or not, if you get a strong smell from crushing the leaf in your hand, then there's a fair chance it's got a high level of resins, oils, or waxes in them that's providing that smell. So it's not just eucalypts, it's other species as well. So that's a good test to see how flammable it might be. So what happens with those oils is they might only be 2% of the content, but they can double the size of the flames that you get from that vegetation. So typically from a lot of vegetation, the flames will be about twice the height of the vegetation. If you've got those oils and resins in leaves, then it can be 3 to 4 times the height of the vegetation, dramatically increase the length of the flame. And that then tells you how far away you need to be from those vegetations if you want to avoid the flame contact.
We're going to run out of time here. I've got one for Justin here. Does that chart that you showed us indicate that 50% of people killed by bushfire die within 50 metres of their home? And does vegetation play a part in it?
Yeah, so that was all fatalities outside. So it's not counting the people inside the house, but the people that were caught outside, it was over 60% were within 100 metres, and it's something like 50% within 50 metres. That's right. So the specific vegetation and the role of the vegetation immediately around the house is absolutely pivotal. So we need to think about contingencies that if a house burns down, do you have a safe place to move out into an open area free of these fuels, both heavy and fine? And I think it really puts an important context onto the real role of veg management. It's not just about a house bushfire interaction, it's about safe places and backup plans for people if they're caught in these situations.
Thank you all. Now, Rowan, can you show us the results of poll number 2, please? Okay, you want to kick off, Kevin, with some comments on the poll?
Yeah, look, I think some of the, we've got 60% of people saying removing the dead leaves, twigs and bark underneath the trees is the number one thing. And that's exactly right, really, because it's that surface fuel that basically is carrying the fire. If you break up the continuity of that prevents the spread of the fire to some of the other elements in the landscape. So the reality is you ought to be doing basically all of those things, but the number one priority is getting rid of that surface fuel to break up the continuity. And even in just the planning and design of your garden, to make sure that you've got significant areas of no fuel anyway, with paths, water bodies, roads, and the like. So yeah, so I really like that 60% of people have seen that, how important that continuity, the horizontal continuity is there by cleaning up that surface fuel.
Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I will. I think Kevin touched on it there, but the design of your garden is really important as well. Allowing it, the design will make it easy or really, really difficult to get in under those trees and shrubs to remove that loose dead material. So that's another thing to consider.
Thanks, Nick. I guess my take homes from today, I've found both of the presentations really useful, and the fact that we had at our peak attendance 146 people watching is pretty impressive as well. The other thing, the big take home for me was that notion that if you're looking, there's your own vegetation, but your neighbour's vegetation. It can be a communal activity, making these assessments, getting some support from the local CFA, talking with your council fire prevention officer if that is useful, and people working together can make a difference in their immediate locality. Aside from all those things that you should do to assess your own situation. I thank you all for your contributions. We did get through all the questions, which was terrific. I think it was pretty a challenging session for people, and I hope that the people watching are really motivated to reassess their properties and you know, plan what to do if they're faced with a bushfire. When you leave tonight's webinar, you'll automatically receive a short questionnaire, and the feedback that we've received from these surveys are really, really useful. They help the BRI improve, but they also add to a great compendium of ideas for to help other people. So please complete that survey when you see it. I'd like to acknowledge Max Garner, Mark Gravel, Lisa O'Brien, Alan Bloom, Max Coleman, Fiona Mackin, Peter Milton Hall, Tammy Garrett for their commitment in conducting the webinar series and maintaining that very informative website. And also thanks to Maggie Broom, Arthur Coates and John Bishop of Ringwood Movie Makers for their invaluable assistance as well. Special thanks go to CFA District 14 HQ for their support in providing the webinar platform, and especially the technical assistance and the advice provided by Rowan Thornton. Our next webinar, I think we've got a slide for that. There it is. Our next webinar, Your Last Resort Options. 7:30, 24th of August. Justin Leonard, Jim McLennan and Rob Gordon. That promises to be really interesting and very important. Finally, a word about our sponsors. Our Bendigo Bank Community Bank branches have sponsored the series because the topics are fundamental to the safety and well-being of our community. If you're looking at your banking or your insurance needs, please call into one of our local branches in Hurstbridge, Diamond Creek, Eltham, Doreen or Kinglake for the opportunity to quote. Give the branch a call. You'll find the Bendigo Bank products are high quality, very competitive, and you can discuss your needs face-to-face in a branch or with a mobile banker. Thank you and good night.